Welcome to Practically Political. I'm Dave Spencer.
And I'm Carrie Sheffield. Let's get started. Dave, okay, so President Biden has gotten through $3.5 trillion of his agenda once you add up the stimulus, the infrastructure, and now the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Once you see all this spending madness, I'm just wondering, when is it going to stop? Because the Democrats themselves keep running away from Joe Biden. Even now, after all these bills have been passed, they still don't want to be seen with him. So shouldn't that be a clue to the Democrat Party that the voters don't want this type of tax and spend waste?
Well, you're conflating two separate issues. There's the merit and popularity of what he's passed, and then Joe Biden's popularity. And if you look at the public, they're two very different things. Let me also, before I answer your question, let me back up and let's go through some history here. As a Republican, I'm always honest. Unlike a lot of people, I look in the mirror. And historically, when has government spending, the deficit, and government employment gone up over the last 45 years? Republican administrations. Before Ronald Reagan was a great president, but before he came in, we never used to run a deficit unless it was wartime. And again, look at George W. Bush, huge big government spending, big government conservatism was what they called it. Barack Obama, his first term, you had the slowest increase in government spending since Eisenhower. So it's the Republicans more than Democrats that have inflated the deficit, the debt, and all this. So let's get that out of the way. But to answer your question, a lot of these programs are very popular. The infrastructure program was bipartisan, so let's take that out. But if you look at the so-called American Rescue Plan, which is the original $1.9 trillion, and then the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which I will admit is a misnomer, they are both very, very popular. And again, it's the spending. Yes, there are tax increases, but are you going to argue that corporations that are paying zero shouldn't pay at least a little bit of tax? Are you going to argue that corporations that promised to invest in workers and infrastructure had stock buybacks instead, that they shouldn't be taxed on those? I think these are very fair. There is a difference between raising taxes across the board and closing loopholes, and that's what you have here. And as far as the climate provisions go, I think this is the best way to start to address climate change. You do it by subsidizing and encouraging, not by regulating and requiring. And that's what the program is doing. And frankly, there's more, shall we say, euphemistically, transitional benefits to the fossil fuel industry here than I would like to see, but I think conceptually it's fair. So I think this bill overall, yes, is it perfect? No. Once again, thanks to Chuck Schumer, even though he tried to put it on Arizona's Kyrsten Sinema, they didn't get rid of the hedge fund loophole, the so-called carried interest, which is uproarious, and that's Chuck Schumer helping his New York hedge fund buddies. But other than that, I think considering how polarized this is and considering how ruinous our politics have become, it's the best that we could hope for.
Oh, Dave, I love you, but gonna have to disagree. I mean, the nonpartisan Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, they estimated that between 78 to 90% of the money the IRS is going to raise from this Inflation Reduction Act, it's going to come from taxpayers making less than $200,000 a year, and only about between 4 and 9% is going to come from those making more than $500,000. So this is a tax on poor people. It's a tax on the middle class. So to me, I find that wrong. But I do agree with you that it's a pox on both houses as far as spending, and Republicans have been, not sticking to their principles.
Worse than Democrats.
Front.
Republicans have been far worse, Carrie. You have to acknowledge that.
But we have never seen this level of inflation in 40 years because of Joe Biden's spending and his stimulus package that did nothing but stimulate.
You know it.
It is a significant driver, not to mention his failed energy policies. That's been a significant driver too. Everything from, domestically, and then his foreign policy blunders have enriched the pockets of Putin. So Joe Biden is the, I think, lead cause for inflation, and the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to reduce inflation. Multiple nonpartisan studies showed that. And then this green energy scam, that's really what it is. I like to make the analogy of a diabetes drug. If there was a diabetes drug that was unproven, that was not able to stand on its own 2 feet, and you wanted to shove it on every single diabetes patient nationwide, that would be considered horrific. And that's what happens with green technology. Green technology is not scientifically able to sustain itself. financially, whether it's wind or solar, the capture and the storage, it's just not there. And yet we want to shove it on everyone's backs, poor and middle class people, not only for the direct taxation, but through the energy costs that they're going to pay. And we've seen it in Germany. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The Germans already tried this. And guess who paid more in energy costs? The poor and the middle class of Germans. And guess whose pockets got enriched because the Germans ended up having to get more fossil
totally
fuel
invalid
despite spending
analogy.
Hey, I didn't interrupt you. The Germans have already spent hundreds of billions of dollars on these green energy projects. And what's been the result? Their carbon emissions have gone up and they've had to rely more on Vladimir Putin. So I think it's a wash. It's a scam. It's unproven. And I am all for, testing technology and proving it before shoving it on the backs of poor and middle class people.
Well, first of all, I'm still trying to decipher a lot of that, but your German analogy is way off. The reason Germany got caught between over a barrel, pardon the pun, was because they got rid of all their nuclear energy. They made the stupid decision after the Japanese accident to get rid of nuclear energy. This is where Bernie Sanders and I disagree. When he says, we have to fight climate change, but we need to get rid of nuclear energy, and I'm against fracking. Well, then you're not going to fight climate change. The bottom line is, I'm a pragmatist. For the next 20 years, we're going to get more than 80% of our energy from fossil fuels. That is a fact. It is unchangeable. I think 2045 is a reasonable goal, but 2035 ain't going to happen. So to my Democratic friends out there, we need to be realistic about this. Now, having said that, okay, I don't know, you're fighting this plan. How do you address climate change? The best way to do it is through incentives, okay? And that's what this program does. I agree, you shouldn't beat people over the head and require them to do things. But if you incentivize people to do them, they'll make the decisions, and that'll help the transition. It'll also help solar and wind become cheaper and cheaper. They're already competitive. They'll soon be less expensive. So what we're doing here is we're encouraging the market. We're not requiring people. The transition will happen, but it's not going to happen as quickly as Democrats want. And the German analogy is totally invalid. And I will say one of the reasons that we have an advantage over Europe and China is if you look back to the late 70s and early 80s, we were what I call hydrocarbon vulnerable, right? We didn't have the supply. That's what Europe is right now. We have lots of natural gas. We have oil. Now, I agree, the administration, they shouldn't have canceled the Keystone Pipeline. That didn't do anything. They shouldn't have reduced drilling. If I were president, I would be full steam ahead on alternative fuels, but I would also be full steam ahead on our energy production because that gives us a competitive advantage and we should be prepared. We'll be much better off to make a transition. And in the meantime, you don't have idiotic suggestions. Maybe we should get Iran to increase their production. I agree, it's nuts. But the bottom line is you haven't, nor does the Republican Party, which by the way, used to be involved in solving climate change. Now it's just a party that denies it. There's no constructive solutions and I haven't heard it from you or from them on how to get us to where we need to.
No, I agree with nuclear. You and I agree on nuclear, but the fact is Germany only had a small fraction of their energy on nuclear. So
they did not. It wasn't like France. They had like a third of their power from nuclear. It was a lot.
But their bigger problem has been their assault on fossil fuel. That's been the bigger problem. But I agree with you that and for us, we even have less of that. So nuclear, and I agree with you. We're going to be shared alignment on that issue with nuclear. I think that's the way to go. And I also think that the Biden administration, and I know this because I was in Utah earlier this year and I spoke with someone from the Office of Energy Development from a Republican administration. They're so frustrated with the Biden administration. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth because they refuse to allow federal permits for any of the critical minerals that are under the earth in Utah. Utah is almost 70% federally owned. Joe Biden doesn't care. He's a hypocrite. He will not allow drilling and development of the critical minerals, which we need to create solar panels domestically. So it's such a farce. And not to mention, even if all of these goals were passed, And by the way, I completely disagree with you when you say that it's incentivizing only, because it is hurting people. It's subsidizing rich people like Bill Gates, who's a big investor in this stuff, on the backs of the poor and middle class. And that's the truth. So you want poor people to subsidize the unproven technology of rich investor multi-billionaires like Bill Gates.
Here we go.
We're going to have to disagree on that.
I
think we
will.
should go to the next question.
And by the way, this is the classic Republican. This sounds like Matt Gaetz. Well, first they're going after me and President Trump. Next, they're going to be going after you. And this loaded stats about how this tax increase is going to hit the middle class, that's based on the fact that if you tax corporations, that they're going to pass expenses on to consumers. Well, they need to be paying taxes, whether they're not paying. So those are loaded stats.